This is a smaller part of a talk that I gave about 3 or 4 years ago. And I must say, I'm here at relatively short notice, and I pulled this one off the shelf because I had the idea that today was going to be about effectiveness. And it's only really now that I realise that I'm in the middle of a session about creativity. But that's okay, because it may be that putting something that I wouldn't otherwise have put into this context will make some kind of sense, a new sense. And that could be, in a sense, what creativity is often about. Koestler called it bisociation, bringing together two things that you don't often put together and seeing what comes out of them. So the theme of this is going to be about learning, as we shall see. I just want to say a word or two about the original context of it, to make sense of it. But I think in this context it's going to take on, I hope, different levels of meaning. The original context was a conference about advertising evaluation. And I was posing the question, if after 30 years of the IPA Effectiveness Awards we have got better at evaluation, then have we got better at advertising? Now that's a moot question, but I think it's questionable whether we have got better at advertising or whether organisations in general have got better at advertising. So therefore one wants to ask, well, if that's the case, then why not? Certainly we've learnt a huge amount from the IPA Effectiveness Awards, and Les Binet and Peter Field deserve huge credit for the various publications they've produced, which I think are incredibly valuable. But what I was thinking of was more in the day-to-day, have organisations learnt how to improve the quality of what they do by having better evaluation of what they do? And that led me on to a train of thought, which I'm going to go into now, about the nature of learning. My hypothesis was, even if you have information, then there are barriers in organisational life to translating that into learning. So that's the context really for this piece, and I'm now going to begin with a sort of definition of what, this is one possible definition of what is learning. Clearly there are various ways you can learn things in a classroom, by rote, etc. What I'm talking about is something like this, an adaptive process by which we can improve our performance. So you start off with a goal, say, our goal is to increase our sales or whatever in a business context. And then we take some action to achieve that goal. We do some advertising. And then we observe an outcome, the sales went up or they didn't go up or whatever. Now, from that, you can have what you could call a performance gap, which may be large or it may be small, or it may even be negative, difference between what you expected to happen and what actually did happen. And that, I suggest, is the key learning opportunity. It's at that moment that you have the option either to learn so that you do it different next time, or not to learn, in which case you may not do it any different next time, or you certainly may not do it any better. Let me give you a very simple example. Starting the lawnmower. So here we have the original action is you pull the string of the lawnmower, expecting an outcome, which is that the lawnmower will start. So you pull the string, and then let's say nothing happens. And then you pull it again and nothing happens. Now, how often do you go on pulling that string? Up to a point, I would say. I pull it usually 3 or 4 times, sometimes more. But there's a point beyond which it would be crazy to just go on pulling that string. So you want to go on to the next step, and you stop and think. And at that point you don't just think, but you talk it over with somebody else. Maybe somebody who knows a bit about mowers or has a bit more experience of them than you do. And as a result of that period of reflection, you may come up with various theories as to what's gone wrong. So the most common theory probably with a lawnmower is, have you checked whether there's any petrol in the tank? So then you say, okay, we'll change the plan. Instead of pulling the string yet again, we'll go and check the tank and we'll find some petrol and we'll put some more petrol in, and then we'll pull the string again. So then you have your action and your outcome, and it either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then you can go through that cycle again until, with a bit of luck, you've learnt what the answer is. In any case, each time you go round that circle, you have learnt something about the mower and how to deal with it. Now, this is a banal example. Oh, sorry. My slides are... Oh, that wasn't meant to be building, but it's not. No. The example is banal, but it will serve to introduce this idea of the learning cycle, which is attributable to a guy called David Kolb, who wrote a very big fat book called Experiential Learning, and I've slightly adapted his language to keep it simple. But I've found this an incredibly helpful concept in thinking about the nature of learning ever since I came across it many years ago. And the point I want to emphasize is that for learning to take place, you really have to move around the whole cycle and to keep moving around the whole cycle. Just taking action isn't learning. Just studying theory isn't learning. And just planning isn't learning. They need to be joined up. And if we don't pass through all the stages of the cycle, no learning takes place, or at best we'll end up like Peter Cook, who said, "I believe I've learnt from my mistakes and I could repeat them all perfectly." I often feel like that. There's deep truth in that. Just doing the same thing over again doesn't lead to improvement. And someone once asked Vladimir Ashkenazy, the great pianist, what was his secret. And he said, "My secret is I do not practice wrong notes." As a pianist, I can relate to that too. So if we don't apply the learning cycle, we are in effect practicing wrong notes. So now I come on to the main point really, which is why don't we do this all the time? And if you apply this idea of learning to organisations, we'll see that there are many reasons why it's often not so simple. I want to explore some of the behaviours that frequently create barriers to learning. And I've got to say that some of these barriers are not at all easy to change. Some, I think we'll see, are even unwittingly created or reinforced by management in their attempts to make things better. Yet these are the sort of issues that we'll need to work on if we want to improve the quality of learning. So first of all, our ability to learn is hindered if we aren't clear about what the outcomes of our actions are. Now that, of course, in the context of effectiveness, places measurement back into the spotlight. And I think it's never sufficiently recognised that one of the main barriers to learning in advertising effectiveness is simply that the data you really need aren't available. Sometimes that data simply doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist over a long enough timescale, or the data exists but it's not practically available. And those are issues not just of research but of knowledge management, the ways in which information is recorded, stored and shared. Or we have data which we assume measures the right outcomes but maybe doesn't. So those data can be obviously misleading. And that raises the important question of how we defined the outcomes we wanted in the first place. But more of that in a moment. So suppose, however, we get through this stage, we have data that are, if not perfect, at least adequate for some sense-making. What barriers in the organisation may then compromise our ability to make sense of them? Well, these are, I think, things that prevent, first of all, reflection happening, and there are quite a few of them. One common factor is the pressure in organisations for action, for closure, for a quick decision. Much of the daily rhetoric of management rewards concepts like being action-oriented or decisive, and it devalues reflection or theory. Therefore, time and resource will not be devoted to this stage, and indeed, people may be effectively prevented from offering points of view which conflict with a simple drive towards closure. A different dimension is created by the pressure for managers to report success in order to continue to be permitted to proceed with their plans. And this leads to a collective desire to deny or disguise outcomes which don't match the goals that have been set. And if that happens, clearly no learning is going to take place. But if that pattern persists, eventually there will come a point where the real situation can no longer be avoided. And by this time, it may well have become a crisis. The response by senior management is likely to be panic, scapegoating, punishment, and then, in the great words of Tony Blair, quickly moving on, there may be embarrassment and a rhetoric of looking to the future, not the past. And therefore, the proper analysis of what happened will not happen and no learning will take place. Suppose, however, we have allowed some time for reflection, it may well hit another set of problems when the analysis of the situation starts to come up with alternative theories to explain what may be going wrong. In most organisations, there are views which cannot be openly expressed. There are strong traditions of how we do things which carry with them corresponding taboos. Individuals are highly susceptible to the pressures of conformity and of received authority. Saying the unsayable will often lead to being treated as if you had gone mad. And accordingly, there are many subjects which for practical purposes become undiscussable. And in my experience, for example, attempts to discuss how advertising works often fall into this category. It's easy, of course, to avoid the theory box altogether by deriding it as being academic or intellectual, and many cultures are keen to do that. The real issue, I suggest, is more likely that examining the theoretical underpinnings of corporate behaviour can be seen as deeply subversive. Well, if, despite everything, reflection and theory have been allowed to take place, and sometimes they do, then it becomes possible to make plans which offer real alternative and the possibility to try something new. But unless you have been through those prior stages, then plans will either merely repeat what has been tried before, or they will be entirely random. In either case, the planning becomes a fairly futile process. That won't stop the planning taking place. And in the absence of any new understanding, it may well focus on issues of largely irrelevant detail in order to create the illusion that much hard thinking and control is being put in. And then finally, the culture of risk aversion, not being allowed to fail or even sub-optimize, creates an impossible pressure on managers, which is often resolved by procrastination. So meetings, analysis, speculation and argument are prolonged indefinitely, but also pointlessly, because no real learning is taking place. Now, this is paradoxically the exact opposite to the pressure for action which I mentioned earlier. And yet, in my experience, many teams manage to live with these contradictory pressures at the same time. Projects are simultaneously urgent and yet indefinitely delayed by unresolvable debate. The result is usually a lot of stress, but little learning. I just want to add one extra dimension to this cycle before I close. I kind of glossed over the bit where we started from, which is the action. Now, behind the action, there is something which I'm going to call a goal. Something that drives our action is that we're trying to achieve something, and that we're going to make certain assumptions about the kind of action that we need in order to achieve it. So behind our actions, if they're not completely random, and indeed there is a space for random actions if you're talking about creativity, but we won't go there right now. But normally in organisations, actions take place, even if it's implicit, because there are certain goals, there are certain values or strategies, there are certain deep assumptions, or, to quote Peter Senge again, mental models behind the actions which are informing those. I've adapted this from a couple of guys, Senge is one of them. Now, let's go back to that cycle and maybe add a box like that to it. Perhaps we can see now that if we engage in a process of reflection and theorising, we're opening up the possibility not just of planning different actions, but of actually going back and reviewing either the assumptions, the strategies or values, or even the goals that come before those actions. And indeed, if we don't make explicit and challenge these goals, values and assumptions, our actions are unlikely to change in ways that will go beyond them. And if we can consider changing our goals, then that will also change the sense we make of the outcomes we observe and of the outcomes that we pay attention to and the expectation gap between our goals and our outcomes. This idea, which I've adapted from Argyris and Schoen, if you know them, have christened it single and double loop learning, and that's what it is. I just want to illustrate what these might mean in the particular case of how I originally talked about this, but you know, it will apply in broader context as well. But if you apply this to advertising evaluation, for example, here are some possible double loop inquiries, which I think would be interesting ones. And I wonder how often these kind of questions really get asked. But I mean, I'm not saying they don't, but I think they could probably be asked more often. So for example, have we set the right goals? Are we using the right measurements? What are our models of how advertising works? Are our processes delivering the learning that we need? What barriers exist to productive learning in our organisation? What skills or resources should we invest in? And I concluded with 3 general recommendations that perhaps it's time to shift the focus away from just measurement or accountability towards a focus being on learning and performance improvement, and then to address whatever systems and structures or culture change is needed for that in those areas. And finally, a suggestion that double loop learning as well as single loop learning could be applied to goals and action strategies. I hope that makes some sense, and will make more sense in the context, the wider context of the other speakers. Thank you very much.